Awesome. So we are now live on YouTube, and I think we have quite a few viewers joining us from the Google Hangout event page. So I'm Lucille Lamb. I'm head of talent here at Stride, and we have quite a few interesting panelists with us here today from all over. So I'd like to start by introducing Ian McNally, who's a lead front-end engineer here at Stride Consulting. So Ian, would you like to give an introduction of yourself and then pass the mic to each of the speakers? We'll start with Toli, Mitchell, Paul, Rachel, and then Dante in that order. And I'd like for you guys to give a quick introduction of yourselves, what you're working on, your experience, just a quick intro of your experience with React, Angular, or any other JavaScript frameworks. And then we'll go into a quick presentation by Ian on coming to React from Angular and the front-end landscape. And then we'll open up for Q&A. All right? Awesome. Ian, I'll pass it to you.
Cool. Thanks, Lucille. Hello again, everyone. My name is Ian. I'm an engineer at Stride. I've been specializing in websites for 4 or 5 years. I think my first professional experience was on a large-scale backbone application in 2008, 2009. I soon moved to Angular about a year later, and I was on a project with Angular and CoffeeScript for what seemed like an eternity, but was about 2 years. And then, so I've been at Stride for the better part of a year, and recently we've been working at rebuilding a website for Saks Fifth Avenue in React, making it responsive and integrating it with the content management system. So that's a little bit about me, and you'll hear my voice plenty later, but I'm going to pass the mic to Toli.
Hello, I'm Toli. Right now I'm working on a few startups. One of them is a med tech startup. Another one is in market research. So in the past, I've worked mostly with these more traditional JavaScript MVC frameworks, specifically Backbone.js. But recently, I've been playing around with the React ecosystem and loving it a lot. It's changed development quite a bit.
Okay, my name is Mitch Marks. I'm currently working for a telecom, which I will not mention. I'm from the Ruby on Rails world, and so we're used to building full-stack web applications, all served from a Rails server. For the past couple of years, we've been taking our Rails servers and turning them into RESTful servers and writing single-page Angular applications as clients. So we've written several of those and have about 2 years' experience in Angular now. Don't know anything about React, so in the comparison, when you talk about React, I'm going to have to go duh. And, so anyway, that's me.
Am I going next?
Oh, yeah.
My name is Rachel Ober. I currently work at Paperless Post in Manhattan. I've been historically a Ruby on Rails developer for many years, and then whenever I started working at Paperless, I have focused primarily on our front end, and our stack is Ruby on Rails with Sass and Haml. And about 2 years ago, we started experimenting with React and other frameworks for our front end, and it's really kind of gotten popular here. And I don't really have any experience in Angular, so at least I'll be with you, and I'll be able to talk more about React than Angular.
Hey, my name is Paul Christoph, and I work at a startup at DataWorks, and my background is with Backbone. Like I started with that, and then after a while I tried out Angular for a few months, and then finally made the switch to React. So I kind of have some perspective on like why I ended up choosing React over Angular, and why I use it on in the startups that I help build.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Dante. I'm down here in sunny South Florida, representing Sync Games with our flagship product, Let's Rumble. I also have my startup of my own called Triple, which is a dating service. In our experience with AngularJS and React, we've come to a good understanding of what the current mode of the ecosystem is, at least how it relates to us, someone who's running a production software with constraints and a need to continue developing with the market pace. We found React has been instrumental in that, and I'd love to share the kind of experience we've had along the way.
Awesome. I think that's everybody on the panel. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. We have a lot of audience viewing this event live. So for the audience, if you want to chime in with questions throughout the Hangout or as we open up for the live Q&A, there should be a Q&A app on the Hangout, or you can comment on the Google Plus event page in the comment section for the YouTube video. I'll be collecting those questions throughout this event and asking the panelists so that we can answer the questions live. So I'll let Ian start off with a little presentation on the front-end landscape. Ian?
Awesome. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, let's talk about building websites. So in thinking about how people go about choosing what technologies to use today for the front end, I thought it would be useful to talk about the history of building websites, where we came from, and how that affects our choices today. So let's kick it off. Talking about computers, and I'd like to point out that a group of women were the original programmers, and we should celebrate that. So when we started, people were doing cool things with computers, like solving complex math problems, creating music, but it wasn't before long before we got to wanting to share our ideas and communicate outside of our local network. So the first level of internet communication was text-based. As you see from this note from Mr. Wong, he was a pioneer in e-commerce by emailing his clients. The idea was you would send text through terminals to one another in this sort of primitive form of communication. So when we actually move on to websites, this is actually the first website which came from the W3C. You can see their mission statement is that the World Wide Web is an information retrieval initiative connecting the large universe of documents. So this is the beginning of the information superhighway, as some people would call it very briefly. And it was a way of presenting information and hyperlinking to other documents. And it's important to note that this started as a very static markup. This is your layout, and this is the information that you're sharing. And before too long, we got tables and we got CSS as a way of customizing what information we were presenting in a unique way. Markup at this point was still static. So eventually we got to interactive websites. This is where you start to see JavaScript and HTML. This is where we briefly saw Flash. We're seeing asynchronous JavaScript to load and display dynamic content, and you start to see jQuery. And this is really the beginning of dynamic sites, but as this image will show you, it started to become what is affectionately referred to as spaghetti code. So from our first foray into interactive websites, we started getting spaghetti code bases. So we had JavaScript mixed in HTML, we had HTML mixed in JavaScript. There were no real separation of concerns, and there's no clear division of ownership responsibilities. So what this led to was a code base that was hard to maintain, and it was difficult to build an application or a website with any sort of complexity. So this is where JavaScript frameworks enter the fold. They gave you sort of the building blocks to create a separated, architected website. And the first real popular entrant was Backbone.js. So in their own words, Backbone was built to give structure to web applications. And the way they did it was by creating models, creating views that had events, both to send and receive, and you had templated HTML for dynamic content, and you had controllers to keep control of it. And it's funny to note that this image for the Backbone.js website came up when you searched jQuery spaghetti, so one sort of led to the other. So Backbone's approach was to take a light touch. They weren't too opinionated. They basically gave you the building blocks, which led to people building their own solutions, so every project might have a different way of handling things. And what they gave us was a lot of flexibility, but it also led to a sort of scattered set of approaches. Every company was sort of doing it a bit differently, and you ended up doing a lot of grunt work to get your app running. Eventually, an ecosystem built around it, most notably like Marionette.js, and it's still thriving today, and that's why a lot of people use it, because you have a lot of low-level control over what's going on in your application at any given time. One of my bones to pick with Backbone.js is that it was not very unit testable. So on a project where it was completely Backbone, we ended up having like a 400-suite Selenium test code base that took 40 minutes spread out over 5 computers. So fast forward a few years and we have Angular. So Angular's mission statement is that it is HTML enhanced for web applications. So what Angular did was give power back to HTML. So you had no more templates, and your HTML was declarative. You could say where your data was coming from and how a certain element should behave when it is interacted with. Angular also introduced two-way data bindings, which means data could be either input from the user by the view, or it could be updated in the controller, and both the view and the controller would be magically updated or kept in sync. And what this did, it made dynamic sites easy. It made single-page apps a breeze because Angular really brought an ecosystem, a sort of all-in-one solution to building these single. Very powerful. It comes with a steep learning curve, and Angular is generally pretty testable. I think it was one of their design focuses. Fast forward again 1 to 3 years, and we have ReactJS. So ReactJS' mission statement is that it is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So from the start, you can see they have a less focused mission, and my hope is that they spend more time coding React than actually developing a proper mission statement. That said, React does seem to come in response to Angular. Particularly, it addressed a few issues surrounding performance of large data sets, and it simplified the life cycle of a component, whereas Angular ran on its own sort of cycle and loop, and you sometimes had to modify the update cycle directly to get it to behave in a way that you expected. So React condensed the separation between HTML by introducing a markup language called JSX that's similar to HTML and belongs right in your JavaScript. So you have a sort of view and controller all in one. React is great because it's highly testable. It has data validation. There's much less of a learning curve. And it integrates into the JavaScript landscape more easily. So you can make use of different modules, different front-end modules. It's not an all-in-one solution. As they like to say, it's the V and MVC. But if you want to be building single-page applications, there's an ecosystem building around it. I'm thinking like React Router and so on, and React Motion, Redux. Server rendering is an important issue, especially for response times, and React handles server rendering really well, and it has the ability to bootstrap itself when it runs on the client. React is big on a unidirectional data flow, so there's only ever one way a view can change. So to make sense of the evolving tech landscape, the rapid change, I thought it would be helpful to take a brief diversion into art history. You see a lot of parallels of rapid change and the idea that a movement starts as a reaction to the last one in the same way that a new framework usually evolves from the pain points of the preceding one. So in the early and high Renaissance, you had what's considered the rebirth of classical culture, and you can argue that it's the birth of contemporary art. So around this time, Gutenberg was inventing movable type, the Turks were conquering Constantinople, Columbus was landing in the New World, and Martin Luther was starting the Reformation. You have this period is followed by the Baroque and Neoclassical, which in turn led to Romanticism. So what was happening in the Romantic era was war and revolution. You've got the American one, you've got the French one. Napoleon was crowned the Emperor of France, and the paintings of this time reflect a triumph of imagination and individuality, which was a reaction to Neoclassicism and the Renaissance before it, and it was very much a product of its time. So after all these wars, you had a sort of return to normalcy. So immediately following Romanticism, you have realism, which was realistic portrayals of everyday life. Again, this was a reaction to Romanticism's larger-than-life depictions of war and life during wartime. And after the wars, realism reflected a sense of austerity that the previous generation did not. So again, reacting to the everyday is the period of Impressionism. The idea is that things are ephemeral, it's slightly escapist, and that it doesn't accurately reflect reality, and you can impose some meaning onto it. So a lot of Impressionist painters were capturing the fleeting effects of natural light. And you have, following this, you have Expressionism and abstract Expressionism. And you can sort of fast forward all the way to modern day, where you can argue that contemporary art has no one style. So a lot of contemporary artists combine ideas both novel and old, and they choose what's best suited to express their ideas and their thoughts. So I thought this was a helpful frame of mind to be in when you're thinking of how you choose your next JavaScript framework, in the same way that contemporary art involves many choices at your disposal. Choosing what JavaScript framework you want is not as straightforward since we have a diverse and strong landscape to be built on. So when choosing what's right for your team's project, I find it helpful to consider what features you're looking for. So we'll start off with server rendering. So React really excels at isomorphic code, which is a fancy word for me, meaning it can run in the browser and on the server. This is great for projects that a component could be rendered in multiple places, like a CMS. It could be run in a CMS, it could be run in some middleware, and it could be run in the browser. So single page support, all three are pretty good at this. I believe that Angular is optimized for it, since it's sort of built-in all-in-one solution. And like I mentioned earlier, both Backbone and React have ecosystems built around for this. And to save you some time developing, it's important that a framework has a strong ecosystem. All three sort of win in this category, with Angular and Backbone being more established just by virtue of coming first. So a big one on a lot of projects is component modularity. And I would argue that React is the most modular. It's sort of the vertical slice of the view means that you can sort of easily swap it in and out and reuse it very easily. Backbone can be portable, but I found it a little harder since your component is spread out over multiple files potentially. And in Angular, it's almost impossible, especially if you want to use an Angular component outside of Angular itself. So as a consultant and as someone who's seen a lot of projects start, the use of onboarding and learning is really important. And I found React to be the easiest to onboard new developers of all experience levels and stacks. Angular, like I mentioned before, is really powerful, but with that power comes a steep learning curve. And basic Backbone is easy, but you do end up having to piece together a lot of parts, and to begin piecing together, it takes a lot of sort of experience and prior knowledge. So lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is unit testing. Unit testing is extremely powerful and simple in React. it, for me, blurs the line between unit and acceptance testing. You can simulate events and interactions with components. You can test the DOM state at any time. You can test the component's internal state. And you can almost do away completely with any sort of browser or Selenium testing. So that's a high-level talk. I want to thank all of you for spending a few minutes listening to me, and especially Stride for sponsoring this event. And so I think I've heard enough of myself blabbing. I would be interested to hear some reactions from everyone else. Let's start with Paul. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in choosing React versus Angular platform?
In choosing it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think for me, like getting into it was the learning curve, like you said, was like incredibly like easy. And when I was like going over tutorials with Angular, I just remember thinking like 2 months into it, I was like, oh man, like there's this whole other like thing that I don't quite get, and I kept like running into these problems that I didn't quite know what was going on inside of the framework. And so I was digging into why certain things like scope would behave in certain ways. Whereas React, like I kind of felt like I was up to speed pretty quickly. You didn't get like the really fun things like ng repeat like for free. Like that was like the first thing you did like with Angular. You're like, wow, this is really powerful. This is amazing. Where you don't really get that with React right off the bat, like that immediate rush. But like 2 or 3 days into it, I felt like my code was modular, and I felt like I was writing better JavaScript because of it. So after using it for a while, I feel like I'm learning more just to be a better programmer in general, instead of like learning the framework of Angular.
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard a lot of talk about like writing plain vanilla JavaScript web apps, and I think writing in React has been as sort of plain as I could have expected, or you can expect from having a framework versus writing your own. So that's been like a sort of pleasant experience for me.
Yeah.
I also had like a long ramp-up time to Angular. I started when it was pretty new, and the documentation was lacking, to put it nicely. And there was like maybe like one O'Reilly book that had come out, and I like skimmed it and sort of trial and error. So Mitchell, I know that you've been pretty well versed in Angular. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience learning it, and maybe what you like about it?
Yeah, the learning curve is significant with Angular. I don't think there's any way to shortcut it, because you're not just learning a library or a view renderer. You're learning a new browser. The browser is like enhanced with its own loop in addition to the browser loop, and you have to know how every piece works, with every other piece before you can even write significant code. I think what you were talking about with the evolution of web paradigms. React is an evolution to address some of the problems in Angular, but so is Angular 2. And some of the things that React does are supposedly addressed in Angular 2 as well. Yeah, it may be Angular 2 is the next evolution, the next painting metaphor, if you will, or maybe it's the Mannerist phase of Angular and it's in decline. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting, Mitch, because we actually got a question from the audience that was about, is it worth building a new application in Angular at this point in time when Angular 2 is coming soon, and are there radical changes for Angular 2? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
First of all, you can start using some pieces of Angular 2 right now, like the router. You could use that in an Angular 1 application. It looks like there's a migration path that's going to be provided and reasonably clear. I remember reading something about you can mix an Angular 1 and Angular 2 application, and that the injector will support both in that mixed type of application. Frankly, I haven't played much with Angular 2. I'm kind of waiting till it's a little more mature. But I'm trusting that the migration path, and we'll be able to use web components and all that stuff, I'm trusting that that's going to work. I don't think Google would just say, well, forget about it, you're on your own, so we'll see.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of buzz at one point when they did not offer a migration plan. But I've seen several articles about like write Angular 1.x now, or like write Angular 2 and Angular 1, or 10 easy steps to make your transition easier. And I think it's actually sort of been officially pulled in. Like the Angular contributors seem pretty attuned to the community.
Well, I'm going to be a late adopter on that one, I think.
So Rachel or Dante, do you have, I forget what stacks you're currently in, but do you have sort of any reaction to, what's going on between different frameworks?
I'd like to jump in. Firstly, on great presentation, the parallels to the art movements that you cited, they're a lot deeper for me than I feel most people, but that's because I'm a nerd. As far as the evolution of these technologies, it's been pretty clear to me for a while now that declarative interfaces are the success that's been allowing the internet the World Wide Web to proliferate the way it has. Right? We had, like you said, dynamic HTML, which was an integration of JavaScript and HTML, but then they decided that doesn't make sense. JavaScript should be separate, and we had HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So the idea has always been specialization. Right? Right now we have a bunch of different technologies that are kind of being mixed together, and we're orchestrating this piece. And it's really contemporary art when you look at really all the different things you're stringing together to get one coherent image in front of this client. And the client's not concerned about what the components of the image are, simply whether or not they can engage with it the way they want to. I found that React has been pretty good with helping the engineers developing these technologies to be wary of the boundaries that they exist in naturally, understanding that information is coming into your component and maybe information is coming out of your component. And just by knowing those interface constraints, you're able to develop software like, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but it was an excellent point, Paul. Paul said it will help you write better code as a consequence of not being able to write hacky code, right? Having those hard boundaries that Angular and Backbone, etc., don't enforce because they're not as opinionated, although Angular has its own little quirks as a result of the runtime. Those quirks, you don't find them in React because React just doesn't allow you to do them. And if you do them, you're asking for it. As far as our experience with Angular, I'm using Angular right now, 1.3. I looked at 2. 2 looked cool. The breaking changes to the API weren't really going to fly with us because we need to be able to continue making money. So the idea was, let's take 1.3 and let's implement React in the key pieces of our stack. Because there are performance considerations you have to keep in mind when developing Angular applications. But frankly, I don't know how many of those performance implications are Angular related and how much of them are related to just how you have to be wary of your system with Angular, right? Angular has an event loop, it has its own digest process, and it has its own expectations about what you're doing with your data. And when you give your information to Angular, you're really doing a pray and forget type situation without really any kind of guarantees about what's going to happen the moment that information is put into your state machine. At least with React, you get component specifications by default because the parameters are listed out at the top of the components. At least in React, you know that these components aren't going to do anything besides render themselves. And at least in React, you understand how the components are laid out hierarchically because they get to inherit the syntax from JSX, right? So there's a ton of benefits, and I'm excited to explore the rest.
Yeah. So one thing that I don't know that gets talked about that much when we're doing these shootouts is testing and how each framework lends itself to testing. So Rachel, I guess this question is for you. Like, how are you guys testing your product?
So our history with React kind of goes back the past few years, and we unfortunately have a really bad track record with testing in general, and this has really kind of shown where, as a result, for instance, we're still stuck on Rails 2.3, and we have like an entire effort right now to upgrade to Rails 4, and that includes better coverage of our testing and just kind of making these very deliberate steps to get up to Rails 4. So whenever we were discussing bringing on React into our stack, we initially did this part of our application at Paperless Post that handled photo uploading and photo galleries. That was something that we added to our events. And at that point, we did a lot of stuff kind of by ourselves. We wrote like a framework that we wanted to be able to use, and this was pre, I think, React being released. And it included the things that we really wanted, which is like you have an event, and then all of the individual components knew how to update themselves on the front end. And whenever we decided that it was time to retire our old Flash card design tool, there was a discussion of like, oh, this React framework looks great. What are the implications of actually starting to use this, and how does it fit into our already legacy app that's now nearing 6 years old? We've since branched out into using other things like integrating React into different parts of our website, where we just try to compartmentalize different areas where we have ownership of the design tool. That's one part of the site, and now we have a new event page that's rolling out to users right now. And as we're upgrading and we want to do a better job of keeping our tools upgraded, obviously testing. So that was a whole story to get to actually answering your question about testing, is now that we have so many different, not only the Rails part, but now we're starting to have really legacy in different ways we're implementing React. So the React that we have on the design tool does not use Flux. That was prior to us really understanding what Flux was and what that could give us. So we had to try to figure out what was like the right way to start testing, and really do a good job of this. We want to increase performance. We want to get everything set. So we kind of all decided. We sat down in a meeting and people kind of gave their ideas for what testing would be and how we would roll out, and we kind of gave it to the people who were doing the most recent work with our reply pages. Said, okay, like go and do test-driven development and come back and tell us how your experience was. And with that, they were looking into. I wasn't immediately involved into it. I think the testing framework is Just. Yeah. So they really implemented the Jest because it would start working with the other tool sets that we were using. And so we're still developing our test plan. So it's like I kind of feel like I can't give like a definitive answer on how well that's going, but it's definitely an evolving process at Paperless, where we do have so many teams that we're now relying more on the React framework and being able to work collaboratively with one another in order to like share what we're learning, not just kind of develop in a vacuum, and then be able to incrementally improve everything that we're working on.
Yeah, I think like at my current clients, we've been building out pretty isolated data component, and we're like, how do we test this? And it feels almost like every day, we're learning, what works for us, what makes a good component test, what's making sure that our tests aren't long running or they're testing the right things. Can we refactor the code and still have it pass the test? So a lot of these best practices, I think, are constantly developing, regardless of what framework. But I think React is such a new thing and lends itself so well to unit testing that everyone's sort of figuring it out. So you did mention performance, Rachel, at one point, and so one of the things that React excels at, and the other frameworks I mentioned don't necessarily, is server rendering. An honorable mention to Ember, by the way, in this category. I can't speak too authoritatively on it since I used it only once and for a week, but I know that also server renders, and server rendering is usually a performance concern. Getting the page down to the user in the shortest amount of time possible. So I want to ask any of the panelists, but I want to start with Toli, because I have not given you Spotlight yet. Have you had to consider server rendering on any of your projects?
Well, like you, I've only played around with it once. I'm definitely pretty excited about it. In general, one of the things that's pretty exciting about React is that ability to sort of replicate this environment on just about anywhere. There are a few packages out there that actually help you build desktop interfaces, so using native desktop components, using native iOS components, Android components, and traditionally with most of the frameworks, even if you had a Cordova wrapper, you were still stuck to using, well, pretty much just HTML elements. Here, the interesting part is that you're abstracting away what is an HTML element, what is not an HTML element, and it kind of opens the door to start developing, you know, not just for the browser in mind, but with any environment in mind.
Sure, sure. So a general question to the entire panel. In your framework of choice, have you ever hit any sort of performance bottlenecks? And I'm curious if you have.
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite catch the end of it.
My question was about like JavaScript framework performance. If you hit any performance bottlenecks either by the framework itself or the animation or frame rate performance issues.
I can jump in on this because we experienced this all day. I'd love to tell you guys about the experience. So first, Let's Rumble has it's a Angular 1.3 harness with a React component that comprises the main screen of the application. On this screen, you can have anywhere from 100 to 200 interactions happening because it's a fantasy football application, the best fantasy football application, sorry. And as those games are live and these components are updating real time, we needed a system that could scale to that amount of data, right? And there's a ton of things that React does for us that allow us to deal with the scale in a way that's predictable and reproducible. One being the components are self-contained, which means if I put data into a component, I know that that data is not changing until I put another data into it, right? That's not a guarantee you get in the web usually, because you're dealing with a language that's fluid, like JavaScript, and people can modify your elements at will. In our experience with the Angular harness, implementing React on top of it has not really shown any kind of degrade in performance. It does cost us a little bit in app startup, right? Because we are using a Cordova app with an Angular app inside of it, and then a React being basically jerry-rigged on top of that. This is for Let's Rumble though. At Triple, we're just using the vanilla React Native, so we don't have to jump through as many hoops, and we get to use different aspects of the React Native ecosystem as a consequence. We found, on our Angular app, not many performance issues related to React itself, maybe some issues related to moving Angular between different React components. We've had to kind of figure out how to best integrate the two, because there are caveats. On the React Native piece, it's a little different. You're going to get performance issues that crop up as a consequence of maybe your JS scheduler or the runtime itself, because you're running in a JS core environment. It's not directly compatible with the environment you're running in your browser in most cases. The other consideration may be in a React Native environment, your threads are actually separate. Web workers are available, but I haven't seen many people make use of them, although I've done a couple of things with them. But I don't really see them giving the same benefit that React Native's separate thread for UI rendering does. So I'll give you a perfect example of that. My engineer was shooting me a payload for our push notification test, and the payload came through, and we had a memory leak in one of his functions. As the function's running, I'm noticing that the screen is frozen, but I can still interact with it because the logic is frozen, but the interface is on another thread. So it was the funniest example of like awesome that I'd ever seen. And those are the cool things that you can do with React Native that honestly we don't really get to try in our Angular harness, even though it's up to parity in terms of quality.
Awesome. So we have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to address some of the live questions coming in from the audience that are getting upvoted, which I'm excited about. So it looks like the top voted question right now is, have any of you discovered any prominent anti-patterns with React?
Common what? Sorry.
Anti-patterns?
Oh,
Yes, I think using data is kind of like the big idea about React, and so for me, like seeing, people setting state in like subcomponents, whereas like you really want things to be. The idea is that it's like a flux idea, basically, like data being set in the store and then like hitting one component that trickles down the rest of the way. Whereas like if you're kind of changing state down the tree somewhere, then you're not really using React in the right way.
And that's usually a result. I'm sorry, Rachel, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna. This is a different thing, but like kind of like one of my biggest projects here at Paperless right now is developing this pattern guide where we're spending a lot of time making these reusable styles, and we would think like React is like a really great thing, and I'm a great thing for solving this problem, and we've really done like a great job trying to separate these styles, make them reusable, and now we want to integrate React into this project as well. And while we've done a lot of work teaching the developers how to separate styles, like trying to like not make them overly specific, and now I have a developer who's been doing a lot of work with React. He's like, Rachel, I think if we can really improve performance if we just put our styles in the React components itself. And I'm like, oh boy, okay, this is really hard. I understand it, and I totally get that it's going to improve performance, but there's something deep down inside me that I've like seriously beat out of myself and like other people on the development team, is that you don't like tightly couple the these elements with your styles, and it's kind of like a hard thing that we might have to like have a come to Jesus moment where it's like, okay, well maybe we have to like actually like if we want to do like really optimum performance of our components, maybe like one day we'll do that, but it's like it's really hard for me to get to that like thinking strategy right now. I'm like, obviously my concern is maintainability, but I've been surprised in the first place that JavaScript got really popular while I had my back turned in the Ruby on Rails world. So I came back, and JavaScript is awesome, so maybe CSS with React will be awesome as well, but I'm not there yet. But that's like something that I'm starting to see emerge.
Well, yeah, you're in good company.
Yeah.
I think a nice middle ground in project is using Webpack and importing CSS files directly from the component, and so they get loaded dynamically, and so your selector will still follow inline styles. I know there's a lot of talk of should we inline style, should we not? Because we've sort of gone back on all the promises we made, like keeping JavaScript out of HTML, keeping HTML out of JavaScript. So maybe inline styles is the next compromise we have.
If I could say, Ian, it's not. I don't really feel it's a compromise. It's kind of like the evolutionary path you were citing, right? It's not one entity that's moving the entire web forward and deciding X, Y, Z. It's a communal effort, and we're all trying to figure it out as we go. So as a consequence, everyone's kind of picking and choosing what works best for them. And that's kind of like what the crux of this conversation is, right? What works best for you guys, so I can figure out what I want to take from it and go tell everyone how cool it is. So from my perspective, the inline styles is really, it's the fact that the component itself is a specification, right? You're not really designing HTML anymore. The HTML simply, you can look at this as like the same way Apple, when they released their new iPhone, they had like this weird old looking clock on the phone, that whole retro whatever. It's like when you use something old to introduce something new. The JSX is something old, right? It's an HTML that we write because we want to lay out how a document is, but we know we're no longer dealing with documents. The document piece is gone for most people building apps. What we're trying to build now is interactive applications with different components, and we want to be able to interoperate different components from different sources. Those sources should include the styles, right? If you want to have a chat widget, you want it to look like you saw it on the website when you wanted it. You don't want it to come in and then have to style it. So I understand where the concern with the inline style comes from, but what I've seen to help with that pattern has been create a theme file, right? Because you can just require it like a normal JavaScript file. put your themes in there with your normal hierarchy of theme.blue, theme.red, theme.whatever, and then inside of your components, reference the theme as just another external dependency, and theme your extra styles on top of the theme's defaults, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about declarative interfaces, which means you're going to have more data than you're usually used to.
You're talking about this is the promise of web components. What you're talking about?
Web components for me, right? That's that idea. Get me a system where the web can finally become the that have to communicate over a channel that was only designed to transport text, right? That's what we're trying to get past. Once we get these React components into the mix, you now have function pipelines, you have state machines, and you have the opportunity for full interoperability without really worrying about what's happening to your data in transit, as long as the components follow the spec, right? So that's the dream. We'll see if it works out.
Awesome. Well, thank you, all of you, for joining us today. We are out of time, unfortunately. This was a really great good discussion. So I have a few other questions that we didn't get a chance to answer from the audience. So I'll shoot that to you guys. And if you want to comment on the YouTube page to answer any of these questions, you're more than welcome to. So thank you guys so much again for joining us. And the video will be up on YouTube for viewing.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
That was great.